Welcome back, friends and comrades. Welcome back to Conrad Hamilton for a new conversation series we're kicking off right now, which we are tentatively calling the Archimedean Point. And we've given it this name because it's a concept from Lukács in his theory of the point of absolute certitude. It's also in Descartes, the standpoint from which an objective reality can be known. Sort of the idea we're playing with. Conrad is currently in Shanghai. I've revealed your location. I just doxed you. You're no longer LARPing now. You are you're outed. And
Welcome to the desert of the real, right? Here we
welcome
go.
to the desert of the real. Yeah. So Conrad is a philosopher. He is. Last conversation with us was about his forthcoming book. Which is a really, really interesting work. And I really benefited from that. He is a Marxist, but in a good way, because Conrad's, his interventions are kind of multiple. Like, you're not like a specialist Marxist, I think. Although, to the extent that you have a specialty in Marxist theory, I would say it's in the concept of abstraction and in real abstraction, which is the topic of your forthcoming book. And I've learned a lot from you on that. And Conrad is
I would say I'm a specialist plus, but that might be self-flattery. So
yeah. So what I wanted to do was to sort of talk about a couple, 3 or 4 articles that you have written and that one that I wrote recently. And I want to start with an article you wrote for Everyday Analysis, which is Alfie Bound's publication, which has kind of been resurrected. It used to be this really interesting blog for like kind of Lacanian theory, and I published I published one piece there. I can kind of share my screen to show you guys, but it's called "The LARPer's New Clothes," and a lot of discourse on the left, sort of trying to work through the meaning of like the simulacra of politics, or like the dimension of history and its repetition. So like, what do we mean by LARPer, right? What do we mean by this strange, uncanny, almost like estranging effect of becoming politically militant in the context in which your militancy is kind of thrown back in your face as largely ineffective, right? So there's a kind of disempowering effect to the radicalism on the contemporary left, and we have a weird situation in which the institutions of the left are dominated by a hegemonic liberalism, which actually pushes against what you might call that organic militancy or organic radicalism amongst the left, but amongst the working class more broadly. And so then the LARPer becomes, I would say, almost like caught in between that, right? In between that space of like the institutional left and like this agitation that is like real and it is persistent, but has no proper expression, either through like spontaneous uprisings or through the predominant institutions of the left. And of course, you're getting the concept from Marx in the 18th Brumaire, which is one of my favorite Marxist texts. Walk us through what you're doing in this article.
yeah, sure. Well, I think one second. I think part of the idea of this, um, it originated in response to Zizek, right? So Zizek wrote an article called Dugan Vance Lacan, right? That was sort of diffused variably. And then it was published in the Everyday Analysis book series by Alfie Bound. And he asked me to furnish a response to that. So this was my attempt at a response. Now, in his article, Zizek makes various rebukes to Alexander Dugan, which isn't really the object of my article. And I think part of that was because I had already engaged with Dugan substantially in an earlier piece called The Apostate Fascism of Alexander Dugan that was published on the Sublation pamphlet series. But where I did find a source of objection with Zizek is he quotes Dugan, and Dugan talks about, this sort of acid Trumpism that has been unleashed, right? The sort of crazed spirit with like QAnon and, Pepe the Frog memes and all of this. And Dugan proposes it as something that, is capable of, he links it up with his vision, right? As in the fourth political theory, opposing the center and the sort of, neoliberal or liberal status quo by virtue of the wielding together of kind of left and right extremes, right? Which is already maybe a little bit asynchronous. So Zizek raises, certain points against this. And at the end of the article, he provides a more developed distillation of what, in a positive side, he sees that the left should do. So I actually have, this was the printed version, you can see, that Alfie put out, and that includes Zizek's article, which itself a response to Dugan, and my response to Zizek. And what Zizek says here, I'll quote from him. He says, "So where do I stand? I define myself as a moderately conservative communist. A communist because it seems obvious to me that only a radical social change will enable us to cope with the mortal threats to our survival: environmental changes, AI controlling our lives, new social changes. Conservative because, following Walter Benjamin, insofar as revolutions in the linear evolutionary sense mean big victories that leave behind many squashed birds, e.g. British colonization of India pushed India towards modernity but left millions dead, we should not be afraid to say that the Benjaminian revolution would be the ultimate counter-revolution, the return and revenge of all squashed birds against the terrible price of progress. For instance, Spartacus lost. Don't forget that he defended a primitive pre-class society against progressive Rome, but the memory of his slave rebellions persists as a virtual shadow and provides a holographic depth to later rebellions. Moderate, because we should always consider the unintended catastrophic consequences of our actions and learn to combine radical measures with steps back. This triad, my own socio-political Borromean knot, perfectly fits Lacanian theory." So I won't belabor all those aspects of it. But what I really, and in a sense, this is a debate not about, the core of political theory, or the core of philosophical theory, as the case may be, but a more practical question of strategy. And where I sort of took issue with this and what I related it to, Zizek, of course, calls for this kind of moderately conservative communism, the awareness of, the blight and the catastrophes that have been imposed through extensive processes of modernization, right? Obvious examples would be like Robespierre, Stalin. He talks about British colonialism as well. But where I took issue with this and what I related to is the fact that it seems to me that what's very interesting about the transformations of left discourse in the past few years is there's been, and I think this is partly a response to the collapse of left populism. I elaborate on that a little bit. But I think that there's been this use of a kind of Marxist-Leninist doctrine to valorize a sort of transgression, right? So if we pull up the actual article, right? 1 second. Yeah, so when I talk about the use of transgression, I give a few examples. In the current left discourse, however, it refers to something. And so I talk about the origin. Let me just restart here. Okay, you're gonna cut all this. What I do is I talk about this sort of performative and willfully transgressive versions of Marxist-Leninism, for example, that have popped up in the past few years. And I relate those to the idea of LARPing, right? Because we have this idea online of LARPing, right? And it's the idea that you sort of masquerade, right? As something born of past, like you're kind of dressing up as like someone from Lenin's army, right? Or you're like shooting AR-15s, right? Or like, you get like the cat girls with the copies of, Mao's Little Red Book or whatever, right? And I think this is seen somewhat derisively, right? But it was interesting to me because I was reading A.M. Gitlitz, right? He has this book about Poseidism, right? This weird sort of Argentinian Trotskyist UFO cult, right?
Right.
And I thought it was actually very interesting because he relates that to Marx's 18th Brumaire. And what he says there is that um, he says that he's talking about how for Marx, whenever revolutionary energies emerge, for Marx, they quote, anxiously conjure up the spirit of the past to their service, borrowing from them names, battle slogans, and costumes in order to present this new scene in world history in time-honored disguise and borrowed language. Thus, quote, Luther put on the mask of the Apostle Paul. The revolution of 1789 to 1814 draped itself alternately in the guise of the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire. And the revolution of 1848 knew nothing better to do than to parody, now 1789, now the revolutionary tradition of 1793 to 95, right? So what Gitlitz kind of extracts from this is that in a way, it's quite funny, right? Because you have this idea of LARPing, right? Which is sort of this superficial assumption, right? Of these postures or, images of the past, right? But he points out that in Marx's description, it's actually characteristic of revolutionary movements that they begin with this, right? Now he doesn't end there, right? Because Marx talks about the need to, he analogizes it to language, right? In a way that might be linked with Hegel, right? Because Hegel talks about, and I bring this up at the end of the article, Hegel talks about how when you learn a new language, like all knowledge for him is analogous to learning a language, right? Because when you start learning a language, you have these dry, dogmatic rules. But when you learn it fully, you rise to kind of glance a new social world,
Yeah,
right? So it's not enough just to assume these rules in the past. They have to be more
sure.
inhabited. Um, but I was asking myself that question, um, and for me, I think what has been the case over the past few years, of course, we have the collapse of left populism, right? And I think that we've experienced, an even more acute crisis that has to do with what's going on with Israel and Palestine in a
Yes.
certain way,
Yes.
right? Because this is something that's not spoken of enough, right? There's this continual, if you look at kind of the mainstream institutions of Western Marxism, there's still this buy-in with the idea of a kind of liberal coalition, Jacobin and so on, right? But then, like, if you look at Jacobin, which by the way isn't even, aligned with the DSA in the way that it was a few years ago by the Bread and Roses Caucus, right? Because I believe
Right.
in the most recent DSA elections, right, it was actually the left that narrowly took control of that, right? But if you look at Jacobin, if you look at their line, it's that we need to continue working with the Democrats,
Hmm.
right? In spite of this sort of catastrophic position on Palestine, right?
Well, I would even say, yeah, there's this sort of duplicity going on because
Yeah.
they adopt what you just articulated as what's called the Harringtonite strategy. And I've done programs on this before, but in the event that people are not aware of what that means, it kind of refers to Michael Harrington, the founder of DSA, who had the realignment theory.
Yeah.
And he also had this almost like religious commitment to the necessity to work with the Democratic Party to the end, like no matter what. And
Yeah.
I think that realignment theory and that kind of fidelity to it and so on um, represents a certain um, social democratic pessimism, which is different than like various like leftcom Marxist pessimisms. You know what I mean? Because theirs is born from like a duplicitous optimism. So they have like
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
optimism that they have to tell to their readership, but for anyone that truly follows the Jacobin line, you can detect underneath it is there's a profound resignation that's actually going on, right?
Yeah.
Right. So that bothers me quite a lot. And the other point I wanted to say to you about this theory of language acquisition in Hegel. I mean that
Hmm.
let's take another concept and apply it here, which is the concept of being pretentious as a intellectual, let's say. And
Yeah.
I would claim, Conrad, that that's like the hardest part of being a thinker are those years where you're trying to talk like your books sound or like your books read, and
Yeah.
you have that uncanny estranged feeling where when then you get accused of using too much jargon. And I would even connect it also, Conrad, to psychoanalysis, because one of the
Yeah.
things I did psychoanalysis when I was in my 20s for 2 years, and I wrote about this, and I basically it all failed. It collapsed
Yeah.
because of this issue, which was I was doing psychoanalysis not to examine my core symptoms and work through it, but to learn the theory.
Yeah.
Right. So it became like a phony self-analysis, which was
Hmm.
actually concealing an education that I was wanting to get in how to understand the concepts. And that's actually why part of the reason why Lacanian psychoanalysis doesn't work in an American context,
Yeah.
because you have this formidable conceptual apparatus, which is sort of taking comparative lit theory. It's taking this like robust humanities focus that Lacan brings out, history, right? He talks about like science, he talks about Marxism, right? And so with all of that, that's heavy. That's really great. It's very rich, but it's extremely difficult to separate that from like the attempt to enter into what in psychoanalysis is called free association. So for that reason, Lacanian psychoanalysis is like really hard to master. The only way I could master it was by mastering the theory to an adequate extent where when I spoke about it, I didn't sound like a LARPer or a pretentious guy. And that
Yeah.
only comes through age. And so I
Hmm.
suppose then to return to this Brummerian point, which is that, yeah, the repetition of the LARPer is cringe, right?
Yeah.
It begins in cringe.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I
Which
feel
we've
like
now inaugurated as a theoretical term here. It begins in cringe. I like
it
that. Okay.
does. It
Yeah. Yeah.
does. I mean, and that's and then in the absence of a viable institutional block which can work with that because I suppose in a certain way the kind of entrepreneurial market sphere sucks up all of that restless energy. And I was in my piece, which we'll talk about in a moment, on loser politics and the rise of infrared, and the that whole thing. I was really influenced by the research of like Amber Frost, who recently did a study on Zoomer political ideology and showed its like irrationalism and incoherence.
Yeah.
And so part of the problem with the collapse in it's a legitimacy crisis of liberal and left-wing institutions, is that cringe has really nowhere to go. Or you know
Yeah.
what I
Yeah.
mean? Or
Yeah.
that so that
Yeah.
kind of it creates like a politics of a restless negativity, which is like inevitably going to be incoherent.
But it gets something really right. And this is something I want to, because I think there's a lot of negative or destructive manifestations of that we can observe, and I'll get back to that in a minute. But I think it does get something really right, which is that I talk about in the piece how, in a way, if you look at the whole arc of our politics, within kind of the mainstream of socialist advocacy over the past 10 years in the Western world, it's been oriented toward this coalition with liberal forces, right? The idea that we can kind of, hijack left liberals, parachute in these populist candidates, and voila, like things are going to work out, right? And part of what has come about because of that is this sort of what I call this kind of reformist superego, right? And this is this kind of idea that, like if you're going to talk about Marxism, it's like, you have to align it with fundamental values with respect to democracy. We can have a qualified critique of identity politics, but we shouldn't go too far, right? We have to respect that kind of experiential cultural vector. If you're going to talk about Stalin or Mao, you have to immediately presage it by saying these are horrible despots, right? Not such a premium is assigned to the heavy blows they dealt toward fascism and colonialism, right? And it's like obviously that discursive hegemony is beginning to crumble, right? With the collapse of left populism. And I
Right.
really do see if you look at like the new, and like something like Losordo's popularity would be very much a symptom of this,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But if you look at if
So
you look at sort of
wait. Let's just make sure that people are clear on that. Losordo's popularity is a sign of the inefficacious or of the false um, capitulation on behalf of democratic socialists to the playbook of liberalism, left liberalism. Is that
yeah,
one way to say it?
yes. That's no, absolutely, absolutely.
I
And
just
and
don't. I
I
just
mean
don't think that's immediately obvious. So I just
okay.
wanted to.
Well, that and I think that when I mentioned about the historical assessments of actually existing socialism, which have existed, and I don't think we should go endlessly in the direction of valorizing those things, because they were also in large part, defensive with respect to the failure of world revolution and these kind of things. But at the same time, I do feel like it reeks of kind of blaming the victim. When you have like a state like the USSR that was, especially in its earlier period, living constantly under the threat of foreign invasion, right? And had to create a kind of martial structure and rapidly industrially develop in anticipation of a war, which did happen, right? And 25 million people died, right? I don't think you can say like, oh, that's all on them. That's just, like there are 200 million people raised out of poverty, right? So these are arguments that need to be countenanced. But I think that some of the new movements, what they really get right is that they understand that right now, like the liberal status quo is very weak, right? And it's propped up by, a handful of kind of, powerful media outlets and corporate backers and legacy institutions. But there's very little widespread enthusiasm for it. And so I find it kind of weird, like this idea that, like we have to, have this liberal line on Stalin, for example, right? When it's like, like look at the right, right? It's like, like Trump refuses to denounce the Proud Boys, right? And it's like, so why do we have to, prostrate ourselves,
Yeah, I mean,
right?
this is reflected in your debate with Burgess and McManus in the forthcoming Flowers for Marx book, which people
Yeah,
will read with Revolt Press soon. I'm writing the forward for this book, and it's a great debate between kind of an Althusserian Marxism in your perspective, coming from where you're coming from, which is not Stalinist. I think it's not to be understood that way. We can define that in a moment, but versus, right, or in conversation with the McManus Burgess tendency, which probably is at least the most, what I like about them is that they are like the most transparently engageable, like representatives of the mainstream of social democracy and all of its
yeah,
tendencies, right?
yeah,
And one of the things that, like, when push comes to shove, right, like what divides the Althusserian from them is about the historical meaning and like symbolic status of Mao Zedong, for example. Are we purely to prioritize Mao as a pure negative lesson in which there's almost like a quasi genocide, which we must associate with entirely, which basically is the position of McManus and Burgess, if we are honest.
mm-hmm.
My position, and I think your position is, this is not a dialectical reading on Mao, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that moreover, or to even embrace such a totalizing liberalized view of Mao would remove all of these vital, like practical insights of Mao. Um, so you see what I'm trying to do. I'm not trying to move to like the level of like what Francois Laruelle accuses Badiou of, which is like fully, fully taking Mao into philosophy, right?
Yeah,
Like an ontological absorption of Mao. Of course, I'm not trying to do that. But it's an interesting point, which is how do you create a kind of ethics as a Marxist of a proper integration of what Losurdo calls a balance sheet. I think is the best idea, right? If you
yeah.
don't have a balance sheet approach to the past, right, um, you will be in this interminable, non-antagonistic relationship to hegemonic liberalism, right? And that's my problem with all of that.
No, absolutely. And I think one of the most interesting, and not to, because when people see the book, they're going to see the critiques which were made of me as well, because it is a debate of sorts. So I don't want to, try to take pot shots in this context, but I will say that one of the things I found really fascinating is that for that book and for the critique of what I term the DSA Jacobin ideology, I actually read through Bhaskar Sankara's book. I forget the title of it. He wrote this book, on his views on. Anyway, I read through it. I forget everything. It just happens. Aging. But no, and that book actually points out himself something really interesting, which is though he's like, for most purposes, avowedly opposed to state communism, He is maybe a little bit more data oriented than Matt or Ben when he approaches these issues, and maybe that's, I don't know, one could speculate that's because of certain links to the third world or whatever. But when he's talking about Mao, he actually points out that one of the ironies of it is we talk about the Great Leap Forward, right, and all the people who died in this, and the numbers are very indefinite. Like we don't know exactly, but like it could have been 30 million, right? Because of this planning error, right? Where basically, I think the most credible account of it is that the government was given, inaccurate information, overestimates of production that had occurred within agriculture, and because of an unresponsive and maybe top down in many respects structure, they screwed up their rationing targets, and this is what happened. Of course, that was the last major famine in China, right? And there were many major ones before that. So that's important to remember, right? It's also been, we've seen the end of famine under the Chinese Communist Party. But one thing he points out is that, if you look at India, right, this is the proper, Gandhi, okay, liberal democracy, right? Like we can all get behind this, right? If you look at India, there's actually been more people who died of starvation than China, right? Now, it didn't occur due to one catastrophic planning error of that nature, right? But it occurred, in the way these things usually occur, right? Which is, year by year, month by month, week by week, right? Because of the incapacity, in a sense, right, of India to engage in a more drastic program whereby it was, for example, delinking from the world market, right? Spending 30 years, right? Completely curtailing consumption in order to privilege the construction of core services, right? Health, education, Medicare, and so on. And actually, I think that there's a quote that chimes with this by Mark Twain. Maybe you've read this one, where he talks about the Terror by Robespierre, right? And Mark Twain, he says that however many people, it was like 10,000 people died in the Terror by Robespierre. And Twain talks about the fact how millions of people have died, right, because of class persecutions in history, famine, right, lack of access to basic resources, and so on, right? But this is like the great untold, right? In the imaginary of our current class society, all we want to focus on, right, is the rapid liquidation of 10,000 mostly rich people, right, in France at that time, right, rather than the much larger collective violence, right, which is a history of class rule. So with that said, and I think it's an important point, with that said, I just want to get back a little bit. Yeah, the Socialist Manifesto, this is the book.
Yeah, that's the one. That's the one. I haven't read this, but it's just one of those things, whereby I feel that fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. It's like we're now at like the fourth iteration of that on the left in terms of the adoption on behalf of like the people that do left-wing politics full time, right? That do socialist work, for which there are very few. There's this sort of this reflexive refusal to embrace another path, another strategy, to embrace experimentation, right? And that criticism I'm putting forward is not reliant on some argument that they are purely driven by the interests of their salaries, or it's reducible to some static conception of their class and their income. I think that there's a heterogeneity, like there's you know what I'm saying? There's an intersecting series of forces that are leading them to repeat these failures. I think the question, Conrad, is not so much because, like the Bolsheviks faced a very curious situation, right? Which was upon succeeding in their revolution, they realized that many of the bureaucrats who were part of the bourgeois establishment actually had to be incorporated into the new revolutionary political caste. And as such, this is why I don't believe that we should be shaming the, Bhaskar Sankaras of the world. You know what I'm saying? Because actually, if we were to take a bigger perspective, no. He's absolutely someone who, I mean, we just have to like, where does he come from, right? He comes from a very interesting, like, Leninist and Kautsky background, right? with a little bit of like New Left Review
Yeah.
Trotskyism,
Yeah.
right? A touch of old 68 thought. The very first magazine of Jacobin talked about libertarian socialism. Literally, they said
Mm.
that in their mission statement, right? So they had that New Left vibe, right? And
Yeah.
but one of the sunk problems of the repetition of the strategy of failure is Harringtonism. And so I suppose the question is, how does one kind of comradely engage them there? Because they are comrades to some extent. I think that this idea of they're just Democrats, just get out of the way. While that may be true objectively, they also have proximity to institutions of power which we don't have access to, right? Which means something, right? So therefore, I feel that there needs to be something slightly more strategic. I don't know how you would characterize that. I guess I'm
Well,
kind of
right.
getting into the
Right.
weeds.
So in my piece, I'm talking about, what I take to be a kind of inchoate rebellion against, the form of liberal coalition, right, that has taken place. And I don't think that that can be merely dismissed, right? I don't think we can just say like, well, these people are online, all too online. I mean, there's a lot of young people as well, which is maybe a promising signal with respect to our views. Now, I do think that that sometimes takes a misbegotten form, right? So I'll give you an example, and I think you can see this like so within the theorization of, for example, mega communism, right? And one thing I consistently see with these people is that there's this idea that you know uh, Trump represents the real working class, right? That MAGA represents the real working class, and that therefore, the approximation, right, or the integration of some of these positions into Marxism, right, is the way to appeal to these demographics. The problem with this is it rests on a very, I would say, no sociological foundation with respect to what the working class actually is. So it's a little bit hard to pin down, and that's a definitional problem within Marxism. But if you look at these actual events, right, like if you look at Capitol Hill, right, they looked at the people who were there, right? I mean, you have members of corporate boards, you have real estate salespeople, realtors, right? Like there was no, it wasn't like these were just all like industrial proletariat, right, or
Of
miners or
course. Yeah,
something.
of
Far, far,
course.
far, far, far from it. And if you look at the trucker movement in Canada, right? It was like, there was an article in the Maple that dealt with this. It was like, you know, um, to go and participate in that movement, it really helped if you were someone who actually owned their own semi,
Yeah.
right? So you, in that sense, right, you were more analogous to like a small business person because there's like an extensive level of capital you have to have up front,
Hmm.
than to the actual waged truckers who were doing that, right up to the fact that fucking Donald Trump, and maybe it's important to remind people right now, is not actually or does not have a heritage of, working at McDonald's other than for photo ops, right? He comes from a colossally rich family of real
Hmm.
estate developers, right? So it's like, there's already a fundamental misidentification that happens
Yeah,
within
there
that.
is. Yeah.
And I think that's very dangerous. And, I thought it was very interesting because the other day somebody said something to me and we were having a discussion and they said that, because, I'm like for the ACP and like mega communist crowd, someone called me an anarchist liberal the other day. So these are
Oh,
apparently,
interesting.
yeah, these are my views. Apparently the people have spoken. Conrad Hamilton is an anarchist liberal. Uh, but that's what I was accused of. But no, it was interesting. And somebody said, they said, you Trots, because I guess I'm also a Trotskyist, you Trots have, or he said McCarthyism said that communism was anti-family, anti-white, anti-male, and anti-religion. And you Trots are out there trying to prove it. We're not going to do that. And I just found that so fascinating, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
rather than actually um, you know, producing an intelligent response, to this onslaught of propaganda, right? There's this idea that, oh, we just need to not be what they caricature us as being, right? Okay, so
Hmm.
let's be pro male, pro family, pro religion, right? What could go wrong, right?
Yeah.
Pro patriotism, pro
Hmm.
America, right?
Hmm.
What could go wrong? and it shows you how much, in a way, like these whole movements arise within a specifically Western context. Because this is the other weird thing, right? Like they have nothing to do with international Marxism. Like they've turned Russia into like a litmus test of whether you're a true Marxist if you support Russia. But like there's no, other than the DPRK, which is no longer Marxist-Leninist, like there's really no major parties or Marxist-Leninist states that support Russia. They might not have embargoed Russia.
Right.
They might have taken a neutral position.
Yeah.
Right. But the idea that that represents Marxism globally is born of a very limited understanding of the global context. So that's an example of. But that having been said, I mean, I do think that there's like an energy that we see within online spaces with young people now. And I wish I was like, I'm of course, as a supposedly elitist professional managerial class academic, I don't have the same knowledge of the podcast scene that I wish. But I do see it online, right, with these people who are really, young people really enthusiastic about, okay, let's read Hogja, right? Like who reads Hogja? You know what I mean? Like the gay communist Muslim who led Albania into having the highest rate of women's workplace integration in the world.
Yeah.
Look it up.
No,
Higher than Sweden.
there is a general sense in that the Zoomer generation, after the pandemic in particular, and the increasing sense in which the online space seemingly has no point of serious difference with offline in the kind of imagination of many Zoomers, combined with the sort of Gaza genocide, the fires in Los Angeles, the sort of sunk inflation, the sense of the collapse of the future, and this polycrisis misery, right? A world on fire, and a world that gives us no reason to hope for anything. There does need to be a spiritual outlet for that, right? There does need to be a space in which the expressive dimension of that can be revealed. And as I put in my article on infrared, and then now the ACP, because they unfortunately see infrared and the ACP as one thing. And my position to Haas has always been that you should not be running the APC or ACP, American Communist Party, that you should just be a spiritual guru of Marxism and do your streams. And I say that because I see the ACP as fomenting a violence with internal to the left, and I don't see it as capable of building a serious coalition or institutional bloc that could truly attain power in the United States because of that fact. And so they operate now on a theory, right? When they are attacked, that they must have a horde-like Mongol structure phalanx against any enemy. So they've completely shut themselves down to criticism. The only figure within their entire community, who is permitted to be the symbolic victor of their struggle, like those old that old Greek style, which is you have two armies that meet on a field, and you either send everybody to fight each other, or you send one representative each army, and then whoever
Did they
wins
really do that? I know
well,
they did that in the movie
that is what infrared is.
I thought that was just
Is
bullshit.
an army. Infrared is an army, like the cover of the Leviathan, where it's with a king with 1,000 individuals. That's what infrared is, right? And that's why it is a kind of alpha, like a silverback male alpha community, right?
Yeah.
And the left, right, largely through the interference of state agencies, has tried to tell infrared that it's best, or not infrared, but tell the left writ large, that in order to combat this movement, we should platform them and play their game, right? Which is you're a fascist, and so on and so on. And it gets into this like that itself just like in a weird way does like a liberal anti-politics onto them, where you play the LARP game back, right? Like I would argue that any accusation of fascism to an anonymous account on social media is a seriously unserious thing to do, right? So, but nonetheless, I don't have a proper strategy on how to overcome the ACP other than engaging them and taking them seriously. And that's what they want. They want to be taken seriously. Haas has asked me to write a criticism of their constitution, which I plan to do, right?
Well,
I will
they want to be
confess.
taken seriously. They want to be taken seriously at their own risk, because so much of the credibility they currently derive, right, is from the sense of importance bequeathed by their exclusion from these discourses,
Correct.
right? So it's like, like that can be very much like a be careful what you wish for kind of situation.
Right.
Because, the problem is when it comes to these kind of theoretical debates and so forth, I mean, I think we're well aware of like, the limitations of the standpoint from which they approach it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
So that's
this actually dovetails kind of nicely to another article I wanted to talk to you about.
well. Let me just finish this
But
quickly.
but
I just
but but
wanted
I
to
just want
say,
to say really quickly,
okay,
it
okay,
dovetails to Joker Part 2
okay. But
very,
let me
very,
just
very
finish
well.
finish up
But go
this
ahead.
part quick. So I'll just say that, with respect to what I was saying, I think that in a sense, if you look at the way that liberal coalitionism or kind of the reformist superego has functioned, it's also created a space for this kind of expression, right? Which is sometimes profoundly misguided. But I think it speaks to a larger misestimation of the political situation that needs to be addressed, which is that, like, today the most ardent, unreconstructed communist somehow becomes credible, like yet another guest sipping whiskey on the Joe Rogan experience, right? Like there's been such a spectacular discreditation of the status quo that there's an opportunity to actually exploit that, right? And use it to advance a more radical agenda. And I think that's exactly where we need to be. And this is why, not out of any deep-seated disagreement with his Lacanian ontology, which I do disagree with, but that's in my thesis. But this is why I disagree with Zizek saying we need a moderately conservative communism. Again, like, fair enough if you want to talk about the discontents of modernity and all that, these are valid topics. But if we're really discussing what's going to work for us right now, then I think that, in a way, it's almost like the aestheticization of transgression has a strategic utility at this point. And I think that's something that, albeit misguidedly at times, a lot of young people right now are attuned to, right? So I think that, I think this is all important to keep in mind.
So let's talk about the aestheticization of transgression. I mean, on the one hand, I think it's a really fascinating concept, and I feel that it also, in a certain way, maybe you could say that um, this concept of like being an edgelord or being a kind of entrepreneur of ideas on the left, or even like let's say that infrared is right, that in order to combat them, what you need to do is create an alternative to them, which will outperform them. Because they think like capitalists. They call themselves
Yeah.
executives, right? They are very capitalistically minded. They think that socialism has already imminently embedded into the social fabric of contemporary capitalism, based on Boris Groys's book on Stalin. Okay. I don't know if you knew that, but it's a very peculiar and very strange, very, very strange conception, but that's what they believe.
It sounds like also Platypus sort of like with their theory that the welfare state is all like this, kind of Stalinist plot or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I think both instances are examples of of a certain perverse like a failure of thinking the meaning of the vanguard, a
Yeah.
crisis in political pedagogy. There's many errors there, but what I'm trying to say is like if that if that is true, that like the future of the left is that we will have this Harringtonite refusal on behalf of bourgeois institutions to ever allow a socialist possibility. Okay. So as such, we need to do like a kind of highly subtractive politics in
Yeah.
which we embrace transgression and we rival the sub parasocial communities, and we find out who is victorious, like which one comes out on top,
Yeah.
who's the most charismatic, who can speak to the worker. Then you then fall into this thing where you have defined the worker on terms which is fully liberal, right? Because what you fail to see is that the worker then becomes defined on how you dress, how you talk. Like, what is the one criticism that the infrared people accuse of me? They say, you're a glasses wearer. Because I put a profile picture wearing glasses. He said, any glasses wearer has nothing to do with the proletariat.
Yeah. They went full Pol Pot on you there. That was the.
Yeah, they are very eager to they're very eager to, this is why I criticize them as accelerating the culture war, and why I see a certain violence intrinsic here. It's not that they're promoting violence. I want to be very clear. We know that now after the allegation came out about gun running. They want nothing to do with violence. They are terrified. They're just like you and everybody. They're like, the LARP has, it's the same thing with Haas when I said, do you really want the Gorky meme on that your people promote about Pride Day, where Gorky says exterminate homosexuals? Do you really want that to be followed through with? And of course, Haas says no, and then continuously says, do not promote that meme to his people, which I credit him for. Okay, so you see, I caught their bluff, right? Which is they don't believe in the LARP. There are limits to the LARP. There are limits.
Sure. Everybody has limits to that. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, like, let's be honest, okay? And the working class is not defined based on whether you are nearsighted.
Okay. Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, like, this is what we're dealing with here. And
but let's be clear, because you're confusing. I think you're conflating two things here. Because I said the aestheticization of transgression, right? To me, one of the advantages of the breadth of kind of like, capitalist cooptation that we've seen in our culture, right? Where, everything from, sexual liberation to, identity politics and so on and so forth, is enveloped by the status quo. To me, what is interesting about that, there are certain things that cannot be assimilated by the status quo. And I think that Marxism is one of those things, precisely because it's so fundamentally threatening, right? So when I say the aestheticization of transgression, what I mean, is exploiting in an age where people are uncomfortable or hostile toward the status quo, exploiting the necessary antipathy or gap, right, which separates Marxism, including its own history, right, from that. Now, I feel like you're talking about something else, right? You're talking about the transformation of the working class away from a kind of structural analysis and into a set of aesthetic characteristics, right? And in that respect, I would completely agree with you. So, but I just want to clarify that I think these are two different things.
well, that's actually part of the
transgression
thing.
can have a
I
utility.
think you're right. I'm talking about a non-dialectical theory of the working class, which argues on the basis of liberalism. You know what it really amounts to, Conrad, which they don't see, is a theory of proletarian consciousness raising based on self-esteem building. Right?
Yeah.
Think about it. The liberals are telling you and policing you, I am going to create a space where you are not policed, where you are free. Okay? We will be perceived as transgressive just by doing that.
Yeah.
Right? And then they will attack us, but it will be unfair. And so what you've done there is that you have assumed a conception of the working class, which argues that the immediacy of your current position is completely adequate. You've created no discourse or no presupposition to change other than something that's largely indistinguishable from Jordan Peterson and self-help.
Yeah.
In my opinion, which is why I said to Haas, continue doing that, because maybe on condition that you are not promoting violence, which I don't think that he does. Okay. I think that, as I've made clear, but if you're helping people like, do the bootstrap thing, right? Like face capitalism a little better, help them with their alienation, give them strength. There's merits in that. That's the same thing I say with Nietzsche. Like, Nietzsche as self-help, I see nothing wrong with that.
Yeah.
On condition that we are clear about the political implications. That's a separate issue. So that you're right. I have diverted it a little bit. So let's return to your point so we're fully clear on like bring it back to that. And then I want to get to Joker too, because I think it's very related.
Yeah, sure. No, absolutely. No, and I was just saying that I think that, there are aspects of Marxism that cannot be assimilated to the status quo, right? Precisely because it challenges, the fundamental axiomatic of, profit creation, surplus value.
How would you like could we talk a little bit more about that? Like that, because that's very interesting to me. When you say go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's like the I mean, capitalism has been like, this is one of the things that Negri will stress, is that in a weird way, if you want to look at the history of capitalism, you have to look at the struggle of workers, right? Like, and how much of workers' struggles, in different kinds of social struggles have been assimilated by the status quo, right? So of course, like the Soviet Union, incorporates women into the workforce and was the first state actually to legalize abortion, in the name of equality, right? Also in the name of, making economic gains, and then, it was also a response to, the image of female people involved and scientists, astronauts at a high level in the space program and so on, that the US is like, oh shit, in the 1950s and 1960s, we need to incorporate women more into the workforce, or we're going to fall behind, right? So this is an example, but it functions on a more abstract level as well, right? Where like, Mark Fisher will write about, the anxiety experienced by Kurt Cobain when he realizes that, his sort of spiritual opposition to, normativity or capitalist society or whatever, has just become a commodity, right? In that way. And obviously with someone like Cobain, for example, right, there was not, and this is characteristic of a lot of Gen X stuff and of course even millennial stuff, but there was not a clear articulation of Marxism or some kind of in that way. So, I think there's something about Marxism that's hard to assimilate to the status quo. And I think that this is even more so the case because, like Zizek talks about this, like how the original productivist narrative of Marxism, there are aspects of it that can be assumed by the status quo, right? So this is what Lenin critiques the Mensheviks for, in some way, and the provisional government later. But we see this where even mainstream economists, right, will justify, sort of a Keynesian redistributionism by appeal to Marx's narratives. But particularly when you consider the history of Marxism, right, in terms of the significance of anti-colonialism as well, right? I mean, this is one thing that Lacerda is very attentive to, right? He argues that in many respects, the thing that made Lenin absolutely despised within the West was precisely the open support he gave to anti-colonialism, because that was fundamentally threatening, right, to deprive, Western imperialist states, right, of these territories that they relied on for extractivism and profit. And of course, we could go back and read Lenin on imperialism and all of this. So if you look at, the enormous impact, right, or crisis of accumulation triggered by the exit of Russia from the world market and then the exit of China, right, and the strategies that had to be resorted to address that, it's like, so this is what I mean. Like, there's a sense in which the history of Marxism cannot be fully co-opted, and that I think gives you the basis for a certain kind of transgressive potential.
Right.
Right.
And I think it's disingenuous. It often appears a little disingenuously in the sense that in the discourse on the left, when you question the reformist superego, you get quite easily lumped into a box of being ultra leftist or being a supporter of a liberal cliched version of Stalin or Mao, or you get accused of being a kind of idealist, right? So like the meaning of idealism becomes very much like the Spider-Man meme of the guys pointing at each other. But still, nonetheless, there needs to be a serious confrontation with this reformist superego, which I think is a very useful way to think about, because it has many avatars. Like the appearance of the reformist superego appears sometimes in ways which, like, for example, I would suggest to you one of the curious effects of Israel-Palestine, now that we have a ceasefire, was that because most of the liberal left commentariat and like bourgeois elite, Ivy League oriented American intellectuals were not able to support the Democrats in a visible way, what that ended up doing was sheltering them from their own complicity in the wider institution and project of the Democratic Party itself. You see?
Yeah.
Now, that's not to take away from the correct sort of moral and political decision they made to in many cases abstain from voting, or so they say. But it also created a dynamic which I see in Joker too, which is almost like this weird gatekeeping, like hostage, like almost like interminable psyop, whereby it feels often to be the case that these political differences and the power implications that they imply, that they bring out, kind of become highly interpersonalized. And I felt like Joker too, between Lady Gaga's character and Fleck, really represented the dimension of what you're calling the reformist superego, as well as the LARPer question, right?
Yeah.
And it was
Yeah.
very curious. One of the most interesting things about that film was Gaga's character herself.
Yeah.
And I want to invite you to say some more about it. But I mean, even though, of course, we should say that the film was a, colossal failure and all of that, I admire the fact that you tried to bring out some rational kernels of it. Because, upon really watching it, there actually is like a latent political content that is worth gleaning. And so anyway, so for me, what I found most interesting is that she kind of was deceptive regarding her class
Yeah. Yeah.
background.
Yeah. It's very important.
It's very important. And it's also interesting to me precisely because that itself is a reflection of a certain impotence on behalf of like middle class left wing politics as such. Like, for example, the how is there an accountability system in place for the major catastrophic failures of things like the Floyd movement?
Mhm.
It's not just Black Lives Matter's fault. It's not just their fault, right? This was like one of the single largest social movements and mobilizations over a sustained period of time in American history.
Yeah.
Right? Are we going to blame that just on the actions of like how this nonprofit that supposedly represents them, just like Occupy is represented by a nonprofit? No, we can't do that. We can't do that because there was intersecting forces, and there was a spontaneous element that did have that Fleck Joker element to it, right? That lumpen working class rage,
Yeah.
right? Which was uncontainable, unrepresentable, etc. Right? Like all of that, like communist invariance that Badiou talks about. So you saw that appear. And I think as it pertains to the theory of communist invariance, as this idea that communism is almost like a hypothesis which you can locate imminently through that appearance of the masses in revolt, a very Maoist idea. Those events of serious contestation from the masses become retroactively the site of a profound irresponsibility from the left, because nobody can kind of own that failure in a certain way. And so the left is kind of disempowered, and as they're disempowered, it creates a space where people police each other. And so it creates
No,
this like Kafka-esque situation.
Someone like Adolf Reed would argue that in a sense it's already structurally unable to represent, the breadth of the antagonism which exists toward the capitalist status quo, because it's organized in a way that obscures the way that what we're seeing is not a vector of pure racism, but the racialization of class, right? So he looks at the sort of limited statistical data that exists, and he'll say like, well, it seems that there's as many white people killed by police in poor states, like, so it's like what we're really like the really decisive factor is class, but then it's like, obviously the fact there are more Black poor people is inextricable, from the history and structural discrimination which exists in the United States. So I think it's really, really important to keep in mind that the very composition, in a certain sense, whereby I guess Jay-Z and Beyonce would receive their reparation payments rather than, advocating for universal programs and things, is already such that it's not a good conduit for that. But about Joker, so I wrote this article for Everyday Inquiry, which is Alfie's new magazine, also the same one as I wrote the LARPer's New Clothes for. It was called The Trial of the Joker. And the name, of course, is a bit of a double entendre because the film itself, when it came out, there was so much derision. Not completely unlike the first film, but liberal critics really hated this movie. And actually, there was one guy, and he was writing on RogerEbert.com, right, which is now sort of become like a broad a broad platform for different people to assume that prestige. But he talks about how he hated the movie so much that he wrote this sort of vitriolic takedown of it, and then submitted it, realizing he had submitted it 5 hours before the publication ban actually was coming down. So this is, and then he talks about how the very existence of enthusiasm for this movie attests to the sick and twisted world in which we live. I quote, by the way. So this is sort of characteristic of some of the reactions to the film. I think it's very interesting to ask why that is, and I think it could be equally asked in certain respects of the first movie. Obviously, there were some great pieces written by people on the left of the first movie, Slavoj Žižek, Simon Copeland, others weighed in. And I think the real thesis that tended to be advanced from the left was the idea that, the strength of the Joker would be in the way that the film shows you some of the real causes, right, of his rage, right? So we see, the cutting of social services, we see the way that he grew up in this working class neighborhood and was abused and so on and so forth. But, there is no political means by which he could intelligently articulate it. And that in a way is what causes, right, these outbursts of violence, right? So that when he's asked on the show of Murray Franklin, right, well, why did you do this, right? He just responds by saying, can't you see that nobody's nice out there anymore? It's really idiotic, right? And the line that's coalesced around the second film, and I think that, to some extent, when you first tweeted about it, you were maybe equivocally agreeing with this, but the idea that represents a kind of apology, right, for the for what was perceived as the flirtation with the extreme right, clown cell subculture. Is that even a thing? In the first film. So, but I actually don't read it this way. I really don't. And I read it actually as a deepening of this kind of left-wing critique by negation, which I think we see in the first movie, right? Which is to say, the power of it, and Zizek touches on this, the power of it is precisely in the impotency that it displays, right? And the absence of a positive political program that could articulate these demands, right? Like it would be much weaker if it gave us like this very superficial resolution, right? Like, oh, everything's good, right? Because that's not representative of our moment, right? So
Can I say one thing? Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. If anything, people listening probably will hopefully walk away feeling like, hey, maybe I should give this movie another chance, which I think you should. Or at least like, I guess it's out on video now. You can watch it. Probably costs a lot of money because it lost a lot of money. But anyways,
I was talking about Joker 1, but that, yeah.
No. I'm talking about Joker 2, but because in Joker 1, there's a major continuity. Part of the argument is that the reason that there's an impotency is precisely because the articulation of the subjective alienation of Fleck, okay, the Joker himself, has no material constituency. Yeah. And so that's why I argued in my review of it that the Joker 1 constitutes or represents what I call the birth of the political, right? Which is he kind of enacts a kind of clumsy but nonetheless like libidinally charged affirmation of an alienation, which is then universalized. Right? But of course, that universalization does not presuppose an organization or a coherence. No, it presupposes a coming anarchy of that dejected subjectivity. And that's exactly what was foreclosed, like cock-blocked by the director in part 2, which is what we wanted. So he took our fantasy and he robbed it. He took it away from us, because those of us that are like interested in that, what did we want to see? We wanted to see Joker take over Gotham, and maybe he failed, maybe he succeeded, but that didn't happen. That was foreclosed to us, and that was the profound frustration. Instead, we got a kind of weird, paternalistic kind of like psyop and deception in this like arena of the court of law, and a kind of drawn out psychological thing added with some gaga dancing and things of that nature, which you didn't even mention. So I thought that at that structural level, big picture level, it was sending a middle finger to his audience. And how you interpret that middle finger, I interpret it as a weird, almost like hesitation, like almost like Todd Phillips is almost like self-censoring himself. Okay. Because of the fear of what that dejected subjectivity, like if I portray it as overcoming its awkward alienation and succeeding and taking power, I will have created a kind of fait accompli that could have reverberations in the real world. So like if the LARP is successful, I fear that I will become responsible for that. So rather, I want to take the liberal approach and back off. And that's why it was a compromised film, in my opinion.
Okay, so I'm gonna disagree with you a little bit on this. And what I'm gonna say is that, you know, it may have given the middle finger to its audience, and fair enough. But I think, with respect to the idea that it gave a middle finger to its audience by way of liberal apology, which is again the dominant narrative, I'm going to differ with that. And the way I'm going to differ with that is that, so this is like a kind of blend of a musical and a courtroom drama. And I have to admit, maybe I'm especially susceptible because I think that somebody wrote online that, there may be a Venn diagram, of people who like Parapluie de Cherbourg and like edgelord internet philosophy, but it's probably so small audience-wise, you need a microscope to see it. So I'm probably, in that Parapluie de Cherbourg, great movie. But no, but I think that so you have this mix of a musical and a courtroom drama, and I think that what you see on one side is you see, the duplicity of the far right, represented by Lady Gaga, right, which is like this pure vector of transgression that cannot connect with the structural causes or class basis of the violence in the first film, right? It celebrates him, but it celebrates him for reasons which are utterly generic. We don't see the express link to politics. What we do know is that she lies. She claims to be a working class person. In fact, right, she comes from the upper class. But the very absence of politics I take to be political in the sense that I take it to be about a kind of right-wing anti-politics in that respect, right? Now, which would fetishize kind of the violence of the Joker again,
So
without
you're saying,
endeavoring to
so just
understand his
so hold that thought, just on a clarification question. So you're saying that there's a political kernel that she wishes to retain and have continuity with, which is kept at this level of a kind of detached aesthetic politics, like what he represents
yeah,
as an inspiration for like generic, like you mentioned Kurt Cobain. I think a lot of Kurt Cobain, like the grunge thing is like this like perfunctory
yeah,
lifestyle Gen X, right?
yeah,
She wants to like keep the agitation bourgeois.
yeah,
That's why I said psyop, because she wants to keep him there,
yeah,
right? And that then actually leads to a type of revelation of his own psychotic overcoming.
yeah, yeah.
Okay, go on. Sorry.
And I think on the other hand, so the other side of it, which is actually a little trickier, the other side of it is that you have this liberal judiciary, right? Who's saying that he has to, and that itself is internally stratified because you've got Harvey Dent, who's kind of the image of conservative propriety, and he's like, oh, he has to pay for his crimes, right? And then you have the other side who's like, oh, well, he's clearly mentally ill, right? But again, like in both these analytics, we see like the complete absence of like a class-based explanation for his actions, or precisely like a collective explanation, which would explain, in some sense, like the breadth of their appeal for other parties. And in the end, we see this kind of meek confession or capitulation that he makes. But I don't think the function of the film, is to glorify. I mean, what happens, right? He gives this kind of pathetic confession, which itself is very sort of ambivalent if you examine the text of it, right? Is he redeemed, right? Like, is he vindicated by that? Right? On the side of the judiciary, no. They immediately, right? The jury immediately decides for him to face capital punishment, right? In the film, and at the same time, in having done that, he's also lost the column that did support him, right? That was this sort of, you know, bourgeois transgression or whatever you will, which would, in her, the duplicity around her class origins would be analogous to some of the examples I talked about earlier, right? With, the sort of specter of the working class. And then he's no longer useful, right, to those people, right? So he's quickly killed off, right? By the same, and of course, Lady Gaga refuses to help him or run away with him, and so on and so forth. So I think what we see altogether, I think in many ways it's more powerful than if it's staged, like, the success of this, because like we're not at that moment politically or culturally. Now, I'm not saying that in sort of a Blockian way, that the superstructure can't maybe run ahead, and maybe there's something to be said for that. And maybe that's an angle that could have been pursued. And I'm not saying the film doesn't have flaws, but I do think there's a merit associated with what I take to be a deepening of the critique of the first film, so that it shows more explicitly, the tremendous obstruction or limitation of our current political binary in that way, right? And at the end, after he's stabbed, we see him singing, right? He's like, I want to find young son. He quotes the monkeys, right? Forget the exact quote, but it's imbued with religious language. But then it's sort of polysemic, right? It's like, what is going to come of this, right? Is he talking about his literal offspring? Is he talking about, someone who will take up the mantle of Joker, albeit in a more terroristic way that's even less, even more devoid of a social context? Or is he maybe talking about, what Lukács talks about, right? The Archimedean point, the proletarian standpoint as the Archimedean point through which reality can be transformed, right? So I think there's a real ambiguity in that respect.
Yeah, in a certain way, Joker Part 2 is a film about the containment of a raw and expressive antagonistic upsurge, like insurrectionary upsurge on behalf of a dejected subjectivity which has like a of extremely potent identificatory possibility like bound up with it, which accounts for the wild success and popularity of the film, and but also we should be honest that there is also like a certain latent almost like guilt or shame when one identifies with him, right? Because that itself is identifying with a form of subjectivity which itself is so extremely transgressive that it kind of takes us back to this like what I call in my piece loser politics of like the Jordan Peterson complex, right? This kind of like strange, it's not exactly proletarianization as we've known proletarianization historically, but there's like strange sort of like multi-pronged appearance of alienated life. And oftentimes we sort of make this like a generational critique where it's like this kind of every generation passages through this period of some kind of
Yeah.
restless becoming and so on. And I feel that the problem with that generational analysis is that it sort of limits the scope of our theory of alienation. One, by like there's nothing in this Jordan Peterson theory of alienation that has a relation to like production, or like there's no like coherent link to exploitation. So we end up again in the liberal maze of defining it. And so I feel like
Yeah.
the film is kind of like, what was it? The Marquis de Sade was let out of the Bastille in the French Revolution uprising. But before that happened, he had read all of Kant's first critique.
Yeah.
And there's a certain sense that what we wanted was we wanted the externalization of the psychotic madness to have a kind of palpable insurrectionary success, right? At least that was my fantasy. And so that's why I was deeply troubled and let down with the film. But your analysis is very thoughtful. I know we also wanted to talk about a few other things. I think you wanted to raise
We're going to talk about loser politics here, right? A little bit. Your
yeah,
article.
let's talk about
I think the
loser
themes are.
politics, but we
I think
also
the
go
themes are
ahead,
quite related. Yeah,
please.
the themes are quite related, and like I would rather hear you talk about this because, like, I think you can do more justice to it. But obviously, it's touching on, um, the internalization of the status of a loser within, these sort of parasocial, like mega communist ACP discourses. Now, and I just want to put this out here for you because I want you to respond as well. I had a bit of a critique of that article, and my only critique, and I will say this, it seems to me that there's a latency of the theme of Hegelian recognition within it. In terms of this idea of like, the loser, the winner, and the way that our society internalizes this. And, one thing maybe that I felt was that it didn't progress far enough into an economic analysis or historically materialist analysis of the causes of this. So if you read like Alfred von Rethel on fascism or something, he'll talk about, like the significance of like German industry, right? Which Hitler was privileging over like the international banks like Siemens, by basically printing money for armaments and this kind of thing. So when I read that, I wanted more of like a core economic analysis about this works. And maybe it's that you're more like entrenched in psychoanalysis than I am, but that was my only critique. But I wanted to hear you talk about the article and maybe respond to that too.
Yeah, that's a fair critique. I mean, for me, it's a parasocial spiritual self-help community that has
Yeah.
branded itself as a kind of community service communist entity, which is in a interminable, violent war with the existing left. And I don't see anything good coming of that. I think it should completely
Yeah.
restructure itself. As it pertains to my theory of the loser, um, well, no, I mean, I suppose I should have been more clear that I sort of reject the framework. That was actually like the first sentence, which is that it's a myth. So it's sort of
Yeah.
like my
Okay.
conception of this is that it is one of the most like persistent and unacknowledged myths of liberalism, right up there with like the Algerist myth.
Yeah.
So
And we were
there's
talking about
certain
Nietzsche. Yeah.
yeah, there's certain like embedded myths
Yeah.
of political myths, and this is one of them.
Yeah.
And there is a psychoanalytic issue in which one must confront this reality, right? Like one has to face and overcome the psychic misery that could and often does come from internalizing it. And I think that many
Yeah.
people in our society do internalize it. Some do this well, some do this less well. The Nietzschean solution is to internalize it and ultimately to affirm it and to come out on top. And I
Yeah.
wanted to say that this represents an anti-Marxist pole. That could have been more stated more clearly. I state that more clearly in my book. Okay. So I'm opposed to the framework. Did I give a Marxist alternative, is what you're saying? And the answer is no, I didn't.
Not an
What I did,
alternative, but what I was looking about, because you were talking about the ubiquity of it within our culture, and also the way that it functions within the far right, if I remember properly. And I was just curious about how you might relate that more to economic structures a little bit. Maybe it's too much an ask right now, but that was just like my critique or addition that I would offer.
yeah, that's a good question.
I mean, in a sense, it's obvious, right? Because like, capitalism, in spite of like the pretension that we all have, equal rights, like, or the provision of equal formal rights, capitalism clearly does stratify people into winning and losing categories, right? So something like that is sort of
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I mean, I suppose that the internalization of this myth functions a bit paradoxically vis-a-vis one's class uh, origins as well as their class experience, and we could say. And one of the things I've been tracking and studying lately, Conrad, is this idea that often it is the case that middle and upper middle class people are sort of sheltered by liberal institutions, whether it be the university, the NGO sector, etc., sheltered from like those institutions provide a kind of cover um, for for their ideas and for their worldviews to kind of go uncriticized or unchallenged. And I think that this idea of safe space and this kind of like sheltering paternalism of those institutions has done a certain damage because that's not the subjective experience of working class people. In fact, there is a certain weird, like perverse market equality that working class people experience often because they don't have access there.
yeah,
So they have to prove themselves elsewhere. And that then becomes the allure of a parasocial community, especially one that sees itself as a combat community
mhm,
because you have been excluded by those institutions, you're going to want to find an alternative institution which will adequately reveal
yeah, yeah,
injustice. So there's a question of resentment.
yeah,
There's a question of resentment that emerges here. Now, I think that this is where Nietzsche can help Marxists because Marx doesn't have, I would argue, a um, elaborate or sort of thorough analysis of political resentment. And I think that Nietzsche does.
mhm,
And it's very deep and it's very thorough, right? And there is a sense that the falseness of his prescriptions as well as like the errors of the causes of resentment in his eyes provide ample opportunities for us to actually kind of approach the genealogy of resentment but derive different conclusions than Nietzsche does. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because one of
Mhm.
the biggest prescriptions of Nietzsche's critique of resentment is ultimately a prescription for what I argue is a foreign embrace of a correction of the status quo, for a freezing of the class struggle, and a correction and an operation of a community building objective that would insert itself within the bourgeoisie, which is,
Yeah.
Lukács. I get this from Lukács's core insight. So that was the analysis that I'm working with. It's primarily Nietzschean. Now, if you want to talk about the political economy of the right, the political economy of reaction, let's do that in the next Archimedean Point, because
Yeah.
this is a huge thing that you're writing about as well. So, like, let's
Yeah.
reserve that. I can't get into
Yeah.
all of that right now.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we had a few other things. There was something to touch on maybe before we conclude. There were a few other things that I think could be touched on briefly. So I got to say, one thing I've been seeing over the last few days, and it is very powerful. And I mentioned this before, right? Like, with Trump winning the second time, it's almost a sort of like first is tragedy, then is farce kind of situation, right? Where Marx says like all world historical events have to repeat twice, right? So Napoleon had to be defeated twice before people really knew he was defeated. And I think we're seeing now, you saw it with, for example, Mark Zuckerberg's comments about masculinity, right, which have been widely sort
Yeah.
of ballyhooed by the
Yeah.
liberal press. And we're actually more equivocal than they're sometimes made out to be because, Zuckerberg is at bottom, a champion of the platform that he, began developing as a teenager, and I think natively sort of apolitical. So we know, for example, that he bought copies of Xi Jinping's The Governance of China for all his employees when he was trying to break the Chinese market. So, but that precise apoliticism is going to be apparent. So when he talked about masculine energy, it seemed very contrived to me. But when he talked about it, he said something like, um, well, I think it's really good that we have different kinds of energy, right? We got to be open to that. But to say that masculine energy, that's bad, I just think there's something about it that's important. It's like this kind of statement, right? So it's a very kind of mild, co-optation. But we know that he's putting people who are adjacent to Trumpist ideas, right, at Meta to try to sidle up to the administration and all of that, right? So but we're seeing this big hegemonic shift. And one thing that I a lot of it and more publicity is being allotted to conservative thinkers as well. And I read the interview with Curtis Yarvin that was in the New York Times.
Yeah. Yeah.
And of course, like, I can't imagine an institution more sort of antithetical, or at least at the level of rhetorical affirmation, antithetical to Yarvin's agenda than the New York Times, which I think he regularly singles out as being, representative of what he terms the cathedral, right? The sort of
Yeah.
powerful array of liberal institutions. But I found it very interesting, also because it was like this very liberal style of journalism where the interviewer was felt compelled to constantly sort of object, right? And to get him on track. And in a way, this actually served a useful function because one of the things that Yarvin typically does is he goes into these long historical digressions, right? Rather than sort of succinctly saying what he thinks. And so the New York Times interview functioned in an interesting way because of the editing and because of the way they were prompting him to be direct over and over. I think we get a better sense of his holistic views than we
Yeah.
might get through some other outlets.
Yeah.
And,
Totally. Hmm.
but I think, do you have anything to add on that? Is there anything you want to say?
No, I do. I have one thing. I just found it
Yeah.
really funny that like it'll be very curious how the liberal institutions will seek to exaggerate and demonize thinkers like Yarvin when, like, strategically, like, it kind of shows that it shows almost like the tragedy of the exclusion of Marxist intellectuals from the public discourse, right? Because when I was listening to his nonsense, I had the feeling that, like, not only is it like sophomoric in terms of like content, but like the liberal interlocutor has no intellectual proclivities. It's like they couldn't even engage him there.
Yeah.
Instead, it was treated as like an exoticism.
Yeah.
They exoticized him, and that exoticization became the site of a fascination of like some like horror, right, or some kind of like, which then allows for exactly what they want, which is to allow for some like false portrayal of Yarvin as like a Dugan to Trump, which he's not, of course.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Dugan
Right.
isn't Dugan to Putin as
Dugan
well.
is
So
not a Dugan to Putin. Yeah, exactly.
yeah, the native narrative is already, but that's what we get with the right? Like House of Mirrors. Um, no, I mean, I actually I thought it was interesting because in his own way he made his weird pitch to the New York Times because at one point, he said, well, the best evidence for the primacy or superiority of monarchy, maybe vis-a-vis our current conversation, is the fact that the New York Times is like a fifth generation hereditary monarchy and it's sort of inexplicably the most trusted news outlet in America, right? Which I thought was an interesting thing, right? Because in a way he's making his appeal, right? And there were a few signs in the interview that he was making his appeal. So obviously, I'm not gonna I'm not a scholar of Yarvin, but I take one of his core and central ideas to be that, democracy is criminally inefficient in a lot of respects, that it generates a great deal of obstruction, and that it has to be paradoxically anchored by a strong sovereignty, even to function with any kind of legitimacy. So he calls for a kind of strong sovereignty
Well, I mean,
to reject.
it's so obvious that he's just talking about a theory of Bonapartism. Because
Yeah, yeah,
what is
yeah,
his first example? It's FDR.
yeah, yeah,
And it's just
yeah,
like, I mean, first of all, it's like such an ahistorical reading of FDR's ascension. It's just, I mean, I thought that it was actually quite embarrassing. I mean, Yarvin is sort of like, for the illiteracy of the American intelligentsia, like he's an enemy they deserve.
yeah. It was embarrassing because they forced him to speak clearly, in spite of the mistake, like the faults of the interviewer. Like, and this is he mostly did it to himself, right? Because when he was asked, all that it took was asking him to evince like a semblance of clarity. But this is really what it gets down to, right? Like, I just want to say a couple things about this. So, obviously, he draws a lot of analogies with corporate, right? He talks about the need for like a CEO, right? And so, for him, he's like, oh well, if California were governed by Apple, right, it would be more efficient or something like this, right? Than this sort of wokeism. But the first point I want to make is that I thought it was very interesting because if you actually analyze not just that interview, but some of the other things he said, there's this sense in which all democracy is communism, right? And this is by a sort of indirect association, right? So he says like that, the most powerful figures in our society are, well, he says that, so we have democracy, and the most powerful figures in our society he says, are professors and journalists or intellectuals, right? Because of their ability to guide and structure popular opinion. And then he says that the only ideology of intellectuals in the United States is communism. Communism is as American as apple pie, right? And so this is like a really weird set of declaratory associations. And it's very interesting, of course, that he conspicuously leaves out like big owners of capital in his list of people who are important, right? Which makes it very germane to that kind of cooptation. But no, I mean, I thought it was very, very interesting, because I feel like the right has, and you see this like very clearly with Peterson and the way he approaches, um, identity politics. The right has gone down the path of just accusing anything it doesn't like of being communism, right? It's like everything from like, pride flags to welfare payments to deficit spending to, you know, um, anti like to laws protecting abortion are communist, right? And I feel like now we're getting a kind of trialing of the next level, right? Where democracy itself, right, will be deemed like a fundamentally communist expression, and stigmatized on that basis.
Yeah.
And I think with Yarvin we see sort of the pernicious evolution of that logic. But I think it's also very interesting because like and you were touching on this with respect to Roosevelt, like he has no class analysis whatsoever.
Right.
So it's like it's completely ahistorical in a sense. So he talks about sovereignty in this way that is indiscriminate with respect to its class base. So I take it as kind of reaching out to the New York Times that he gives Roosevelt, right? At the beginning, he says, well, Roosevelt, was autocratic in a lot of respects. And that is true, right? Like Roosevelt used tax laws to put his opponents in jail. He concentrated a lot of powers and all that. But then at the same time, it's like, what is Roosevelt without popular dissent and American organized labor?
Exactly. Yeah.
And he's nothing,
Hmm.
right? And so like, the category of strong sovereignty, and I think you could talk about what's sometimes been termed left Bonapartism in this
Hmm.
respect,
Hmm.
but the category of strong
Soft.
sovereignty
Yeah.
is not sufficient, to explain even the positive example that he provides. And then at the end of the interview, he says, well, Donald Trump, in many respects, is analogous to Roosevelt, right? He's less part of the establishment of the United States, which is true, right? Because Roosevelt came from the Roosevelt family who made their money selling opium, working out of here in Shanghai. Of course, we have the Roosevelt building here in Shanghai, lest we forget.
Yeah.
But it's like, again, like the class basis of that is completely, and you see the evidence of this complete absence of class analysis at other points. So for example, I think maybe the most embarrassing moment, though there were a few, was at one point they were talking about women's rights, and there's sort of this sophism, and he says like, well, women having free speech is a freedom, but women having the right to vote is a power, and those are different things, and blah 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 blah. But the guy says, well, do you not think it's the case that it's better for women having the right to vote? And his response is, well, Yarvin's response was, if you read a Jane Austen novel, the women in it seem like they're doing pretty well. Which I thought was fantastic, and to me captures already a lot about the right-wing imaginary, because whenever they valorize the past, it's inevitably like an extremely selective image of it. For example, like the Belle Epoque in France functions this way for the far right, right? There's this great romance around the Belle Epoque, and it's like the Belle Epoque was defined by like severe class inequality, like rampant prostitution, regular civil instability. I mean, you had like the fucking 1848 in the Paris Commune, anarchists assassinating people.
There is a long tradition of aristocratic liberalism embracing the Bonapartist dictator precisely in the way that they pacify the plebeian threat. So it may not be that Yarvin has no theory of plebeian, because he probably would put it in terms of like that Roman, like the plebs, if he were to have a class analysis. I think his point would be most likely that a figure like Trump will pacify that possibility of turning them communist, right? That the sovereign then becomes the solution to that, and that they then not only become pacified but kind of like content, sort of like a like basically kind of like a peasantry, or kind of like a kind of passive working class. I think he would fully reject that as already some kind of antiquated Marxist category. So I mean, I think your insights are very sound, and I also find it interesting that like when we invoke the specter of like Yarvin as a fascist, let's say, I have the sense that there's a kind of profound ambiguity and difference between sort of like the Russian. This is something I want to talk in future Archimedean Point episodes about. Is like if we can sort of help people with the topography of contemporary fascism, as like the Duganist node, the Yarvin like Silicon Valley node, and how we draw distinctions therein, right? Because there's also like the more traditional white supremacist node, which actually paradoxically doesn't have the same public visibility. I mean, to a certain extent it does, with that idiot who I absolutely despise, whatever his name is, the Twitter personality that is heavily promoted. His name escapes me, but probably for good reason. The America First guy, his name will come to me. Whoever's watching can put it in the comments. But look, I think we should close for now. Psychoanalysis.
About this topography of fascism, I just want to say that I think that I think that if we're trying to talk about maybe three strands, just as like a provisional way of thinking, I think you could talk about again like the white supremacist strand, which like Hitlerism is very associated with. I think you could talk about with a kind of third worldist strand that Dugan represents, right? Which is different because it involves a reification of culture, but it does so contra the West. And it's more linked to the history of delinking and a sort of perversion of socialist delinking. And then I think you could talk about a third strand, which is almost more like the Franco kind of model. And someone once said something very interesting about Franco. They said Franco wasn't necessarily a fascist, but his opponents were definitely anti-fascist, right? And what I take that to mean is that if you look at what Franco's concerns were, like he wasn't a hyper ideological personality, his concern was basically stabilizing the conditions for capital accumulation, right? And there wasn't like the same gratuitous ideological element that you see with the Nazis, for example. And of course, we know that Franco like embraced Spanish Jews as refugees, and there are lots of wrinkled, still parts of this narrative. But then that also raises the question with respect to Spain of whether Spain's conversion into a democratic society, sometimes it's styled as the defeat of Francoism, but of course there wasn't like a mass movement like in Portugal. You can also see it as the triumph of Francoism, right? Because the ultimate goal, in a sense, or you could argue, and he appointed the monarch who he knew was sympathetic to democracy in certain respects, but you could argue that the ultimate victory of Francoism would be to create this democratic society, knowing full well that it would function within this kind of restricted, because then it's like that's also more liberty to the Spanish bourgeoisie, and a lot of the most powerful families in Spain, they come from that exact fascist lineage. Even today, like there was no truth and reconciliation that was substantive in that respect. So if you look at Yarvin, I would position it more in this way, where it's more like the Francoist tradition, and because I don't think that he has this sort of conspicuous adoration of white supremacy and these kind of things, though a lot of his comments about race are quite dubious. But I think that really what it is it's about, the need for a quote strong sovereign to overcome, the tensions and conflicts which are emerging within civil society, and to stabilize the conditions for capital accumulation. And this is very clear when he talks about the comparison with like a CEO, right? So could we say that, Yarvin is not necessarily fascist, but he is anti-fascist? That might be a better way of describing it. I'm not sure, and I don't propose a definitive solution, but I think it's an interesting thing to explore.
Yeah, so that will be a topic for future. We will do the research. So part of what we want to do is like bring out the research that we do. We're both Marxist writers and thinkers, so that's. I thought this was a good first episode. I want to thank Conrad for coming on, and I want to invite everyone listening to consider becoming a patron on Patreon to support my work. Next up, I have Mladen Dolar of the Slovene School for an interview about Rumors, a new short book of his. Also, most likely going to be speaking very soon with Russell Jacoby, one of my favorite Marxist writers, about American Marxism and academia. We will have a study group that is going to be announced soon. And when you become a Patreon member, we have a vibrant Discord, and you can get in on the gossip on the left and whatever else you wish, and research as well with other comrades. So thank you, Conrad, and until the next time.
Great to be here. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.